Is there evidence of the flood? We've already, if you remember when our guest speaker Stacy Lung came a while ago, she is a geology buff, and so she spent a lot of time discussing evidence of the flood. So online audience, you can refer back to that video if you'd like to see it. But we're going to talk about it again. And yeah, we'll go through what the book says. Some of it we'll kind of gloss over because it might be review. Some of it we're going to spend more time. I took some notes on the homework assignment that I gave weeks ago about the bent rock layers. You might remember that one. So there were a couple of key concepts that I felt like the class as a whole could stand to review. So when we get to that section of this lesson, then we'll review them. But first, we got to make sure we're on the same page for the flood itself. So go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 6, if you have a Bible, which looks like you all do. So turn to Genesis chapter 6. What's that?
I guess we're kind of prepared.
Kind of prepared?
Kind
Yeah.
of prepared.
Every single one of you has a Bible. Most of you are turning to Genesis chapter 6 in that Bible. Moses records the account of Noah. As you recall, Moses is the one who put pen to paper on Genesis, even though it records events from before his life. Likely he inherited some kind of oral tradition, or else was just told by God what to write down. But either way, Moses records the account of Noah, his family, and the universal flood in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. So we don't have time to read the entire account of the flood. Hopefully you guys already have. But remember that the impetus, that is the reason for the flood, was that mankind had grown very wicked. Genesis 6:5 says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." This is back in the days when people were living for centuries. So I guess the cynical assumption that people just get more and more selfish and corrupt and mean as they age might have some merit to it. Because it seems like the longer people live, the more evil they're getting here. But there was one exception, Genesis 6 verse 9. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. So yeah, there's exactly one righteous man left, plus I guess his wife and kids were kind of included there. But if God didn't act fast, there's a very good chance that Noah and his family would be either killed or corrupted by the world around them, and then there'd be no hope. So that's what brought on the flood. God said, "I will destroy the world with a flood, but of course I will save Noah and his family, 8 souls in all." So that's Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and each of their 3 sons had a wife. So that's 8 souls in all. And then of course 2 of every animal to keep the old ecosystem going strong there. 2 of every kind of animal. This is important, the biblical kind. I know I've talked about it before, but it bears repeating, especially in this particular account, because the kind, biblical kind equals animals that can reproduce together. Animals that reproduce. That is defined in Genesis chapter 1, all the way back in the creation account, where God says each after its own kind, when he is making first the plants, and the plants bear seeds after their own kind, and then the animals reproduce after their own kind. And this is important because this does not equal species. A lot of people might think, oh, well, there was just 2 of every species of animal on the ark. But this is not biblical, and it's not necessarily true. So the scientific definition of species is at the bottom of a long list of what's called the taxonomic hierarchy, or taxonomy is shorthand, I guess, for that. Taxonomy is the classification of animals. And it goes, starts real big at the kingdom, and then goes through phylum. Have you guys learned this yet? This might be high school level.
like way back. Like
Oh,
6th
back
grade.
is it? Okay. Yeah. Order, family.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, remember this?
Yeah, like 6th grade.
Genus
Yeah.
and species.
It's been a while.
Yes. Yeah, and I think they have a new one up here now. I forget what it's called. But anyway, when I learned biology, it was just this. And the important thing is that species is at the bottom. However, it's fairly common in the in science. At least I'm going to stick with the animal kingdom. Fairly common in the animal kingdom for creatures of the same genus to be able to reproduce, even if they're not the same species. And in some cases, even creatures of the same family are able to reproduce. And since the biblical kind simply states that they're able to reproduce, we would say that, if you have two animals in the same family that can reproduce, then chances are good they have a common ancestor. Actually, we wouldn't say chances are good. We would say they have a common ancestor. And thus, all of the different specimens of the genus or the species or subspecies or whatever, all of them would be kind of subsumed into one kind that would be on the ark. So when you hear that there are millions and millions of different species of animals and how could they all fit on the ark, you can say, well, they didn't. We didn't need every single modern species. We only needed the common ancestor of each of those modern species. Elliot, you had your hand up.
Domain is another kingdom.
It is very good. Domain. Yeah, I'll throw that up there too. It's not in the mnemonic that I learned for this, so I always forget. There we go.
I did remember something from 6th grade science.
Good job. Yeah, I was gonna put realm, but that's actually more theology than taxonomy. Anyway, yeah. So the biblical kind is animals that can reproduce. And can animals lose the ability to reproduce? Yeah, because sin is destructive and stuff like that. So if we have two different species that can't reproduce nowadays, might they be descended from the same kind? They might, but they probably aren't. But if we have two species that can reproduce, they are definitely descended from the same kind. Because otherwise you'd be saying something like dogs gained the ability to reproduce with cats or something like that, and that's ridiculous. But dogs and wolves, I believe, can reproduce, and coyotes and other canine species. Canis, is Canis a genus or a family? I don't know. Anyway, I like to use dogs as an example because we're all familiar with the various dog breeds. But it's not like Noah had Labradors and Shih Tzus and Great Danes and Vizslas and whatever the heck else. No, he had canines. He had two canines, and from those canines came all of the others. So, again, we creationists, we pretty much agree with the evolutionists on the tree of life business. It's just that we kind of cut it off fairly recently and say this is where God made everything, as it was in its original form, and from there the tree branched into what we have today. So it's the same conclusion based on the same science, and we just assume a younger Earth, and we have very good reasons for that, which we're going to explore some of those today. So anyway, yeah, two of every kind of animal, that's the Bible word, not the same as the word species, was brought onto the ark, except the clean animals, which are suitable for eating. God had Noah bring 7 pairs of those, so that they'd have some animal to eat, could have some meat. After Noah, I remember the first time I read the flood account as like a teenager, I noticed that Noah made a sacrifice of animals to God after he got off the ark, and I was like, oh, maybe those were the unicorns. Noah sacrificed the unicorns or the fire-breathing dragons or some other animal that doesn't exist, and that's why they're not there. But no, he almost certainly just sacrificed an animal that he had extras lying around because God provided for him in that plan. What else? The flood, of course, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. The accounts of the flood when it actually comes onto the earth. Where are we? I'm in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. So a lot of people think that it just rained, but that's not true. In fact, that might not even be the primary source of the water. Yeah, all of the fountains of the great deep burst forth. And so you might remember how Stacy Lung talked about how we have, on the surface of the earth we have the crust, but the crust is relatively thin when compared with the layer underneath it, which is called the mantle. And the mantle is not completely liquid, but it certainly does have, it's certainly hot. And there is a lot of motion of liquid within the mantle, even if it's not completely molten all the way through. And whenever we have volcanoes on the surface of the earth, that is basically a place where the liquid rock in the mantle has found its way through a crack in the thin crust of the earth and is able to come out. And the more pressure it's under, it dictates the bigger the splash. And of course, then when that liquid water cools and solidifies, it makes a mountain that may or may not have a big hole in the middle where more liquid comes out. And that's a volcano basically right there. Well, in the days of Noah's flood, this happened all over the place. And it was more dramatic and more intense than any other volcano has ever been since, almost certainly. And so, yeah, you just imagine the whole crust of the earth has the fountains of the great deep bursting forth all over it. And you might think, well, that's great for lava, but this is water. Well, I said that the crust is not just molten rock. There is also water in there. And a lot of it, because it's under such intense pressure, is part of a chemical compound called a hydrate, where basically the water chemically binds with the rock because it's under so much pressure that it's just kind of, the molecules are forced together. That's the easiest way I can explain it right now. But there's a lot of hydrates in the mantle, more than enough to fill the entire ocean, and that's within the mantle now. I would assume that there was a lot less water on the surface of the earth before. So in addition to the lava coming out of the mantle in Noah's flood, there would definitely have been water. And then of course, what makes rain clouds? Has anyone learned how clouds form? Oh wow, Addison's going for the vocab word. What is it, Addison? Condensation. Very good. So when there's too much water in the air, the water wants to leave the air, and it does that by condensing onto something. This typically happens when the air gets cold, like, I don't know, in the upper reaches of the atmosphere, bordering the vacuum of space. It gets a little cool up there. And so the humidity that was comfortable in the air down where it's hot rises up, cools off, wants to condense, and it tends to condense around dust molecules, or dust particles, not molecules. Which are basically, just collections of molecules. But of course, there would be tons of ash and dust coming up from these volcanic eruptions. So what's going to happen? They're going to cause water to condense around them. You get big, thick, nasty rain clouds. This happens whenever a volcano erupts. So I'm not really making anything up here. It's just happening a lot more because, this volcano is erupting everywhere. And so that's where most of your rain probably came from, is just condensation on the volcanic ash and stuff and dust. And so that's enough rain to flood the earth. You might remember Stacy talked about how let me get a close-up on the crust here. So we're doing a close-up. My green is failing me again. Come on, green, stick with me. We have important work to do. It has to be green because it's the crust. I'm going to draw it down here. So down here we have our green Earth's crust, and it's fine. It's black Earth's crust. This pain in the butt. It's always the green. All right, Earth's crust is black here. There it is. Ta-da! And it gets a crack, of course, and you've got your lava. Your lava is coming up through the crack. There we go, because it's all lava down here, and when this happens on a large scale, so I'm only drawing this in 2 dimensions here, but if you were to look on the surface of the earth, these would not be little holes poking out with lava through them. They would be cracks. They would be fault lines. This is likely where the tectonic plates that we observe today come from. If you didn't know, everything on the surface of the earth is sitting on top of large plates. The crust of the earth is not a convenient solid shell, but it's got lots of deep cracks in it, and every big chunk of rock that is between the cracks is called a tectonic plate. And earthquakes happen when tectonic plates rub together. Have you ever tried rubbing two rough things together? They kind of vibrate each other. I don't know, rumble. They cause, what do they cause? They cause friction. If you rub two pieces of sandpaper together, it gets pretty hot, but that's actually not what I'm going for here. Just imagine you have two gigantic plates that make up a significant portion of the Earth's surface, and they start rubbing together. There's gonna be some vibrations involved, like a car crash. How about that? If you drive your car into a wall and you keep on driving along the wall there, you're gonna be rumbling the car quite a bit. And that's what an earthquake is. So the tectonic plates may have been created by these eruptions in Noah's flood. And something interesting happens if we examine one of those up close. So you start with the lava rising up through the crack here, and then the lava bursts forth, and your crust is going to look something like this. I'm drawing this very intentionally with a curve like this. So the crust, of course, is bursting out, or the lava's bursting out. It's pushing the crust up and back. This is how things behave, right? But then it's still sitting on top of this mostly molten mantle. And so what are these two things going to do? Are they just going to sit there? They're going to slide apart, right? And the problem is that the same thing is happening over here. So, I'll just draw the similar thing. And of course, there isn't a gap between them; they're connected. But what ends up happening is that as they are forced together, forced apart here. Come on. As they're forced apart here, they're forced together here, and in so doing, what ends up happening is that they get bent. Let's see, how do I do this? There you go. Yeah, whether they want to bend or not, they do get bent. It's a rather violent bending. And believe it or not, this is pretty much how evolutionists believe that mountains came to be. Is they crash. I should have these things colliding. Duh. Sure. Here we go. Colliding. Is we're all in pretty much agreement that mountains formed when tectonic plates crash into each other and crumple, like my fingers are doing, like I'm trying to illustrate here. So the plates crash into each other and they crumple, and these are mountains because we're dealing on like a planetary scale here. So yeah, the lava comes out, pushes the plates back into each other, and they crumple and make mountains. This is not an instant process. Stacy mentioned that the fastest these plates were ever moving was probably the speed of an adult man walking. So not very fast. And so these mountains would not have just risen up overnight. But it's important to note that when the Bible says that the floodwaters covered the highest mountain up to 15 feet deep, the mountains were probably not as high as they are now. So that greatly reduces the amount of water needed for Noah's flood to have happened, which is important because one of the big questions that people ask is, well, if the whole world was underwater, then where'd the water go? And of course, you can say a lot of it was subducted back into the mantle, but it's important to note that a lot of it probably just didn't need to be there because the mountains in the times of Noah were not as tall as the mountains are in our times. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I feel like I'm losing a lot of you, but maybe not. Kinda. Okay. Are there any specific questions that you have about this in particular? I should note that the Bible does not go into this much detail This is basically what geologists imagine would happen if there were a flood the way the Bible describes it. But they could be wrong because we weren't there. It's important to recognize, even when the science is working in our favor and we like what it says, it's important to recognize that there are limits to what we can know, and that a lot of this is educated guesswork. All that we really have is the world that we have. We don't have a second world where we can run an experiment and change the variables or something. We have one world, and then we have models that we can use to try to anticipate what could have happened that gave us the world that we have. And so the current most popular creationist model, those are the good guys, the ones that believe in the Bible. The current most popular creationist model is that the fountains of the great deep burst forth all over the world, tearing the surface of the earth into pieces, and those pieces then crashed into each other and crumpled and made mountains. This would have happened over the course of years, plural, not overnight. As fast as it sounds that the flooding happened, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the flood itself lasted just over a year, which is a long time, but it's not that long in the grand scheme of things. We often overlook, we kind of think, oh, the flood event was over in less than 2 years. Well, technically the waters receded, but there was there was upheaval to the Earth's ecosystem that probably is still being felt even today. I'm not going to speculate on the sources of climate change, but there is a non-zero chance that the warming of the Earth that we see now is simply still recovering from the ice age that came about as a result of the flood. Because with all of these clouds up in the sky reflecting the sun's rays, that would have made the Earth quite a bit colder. And as Stacy Lung shared with us, an ice age would have, first of all, had less water in the sea, so the sea level would have been lower as more water was trapped in glaciers, and that would have allowed people to travel over land from the Middle East or Africa or wherever the ark landed. We don't really know, but it would have allowed people to travel overland from there to places like Australia, people and animals, to places like Australia or North America, places that would later become inaccessible as the glaciers melted and the earth warmed. So I'm not offering an opinion on modern climate change. We're talking about big picture stuff. But yeah, it's what the flood did to the earth. You cannot overstate what an impact it had. It completely wiped out any traces of civilization that existed before the flood, and it literally reshaped the face of the earth. Okay, back here. So yeah, we talked about all that. That's most of the science stuff. Of course, the account of the ark in the Bible is pretty cool. And for your homework tonight, we're going to be looking at that account again, but I'm not going to be having you look at folds in the rocks or anything that's scientific. It's going to be about half theology, half science. You're going to look at what the Bible says about the flood being global, because a lot of critics think, well, maybe the Bible was talking about a local flood, like maybe the Mediterranean Sea used to be dry, and then some kind of dam broke between Spain and, have you not heard that before?
Why wouldn't they just travel somewhere? They would have that much time to build an ark and get all those animals on, and then why wouldn't they just travel somewhere else?
Thank you, yes, very good. That is more or less what the article that we're reading says. So Addison's ahead of the game there. But if you haven't heard this theory, we don't believe it, but it's worth sharing. If you imagine, I'm not a cartographer, but if you imagine this is North Africa and this is Southern Europe, so this is it's the Iberian Peninsula. We got Spain, Portugal. I don't know what's over here, but the Sahara Desert somewhere around here. And then you've got the Mediterranean Sea is here. I didn't want to draw everything, but there's Italy and Greece, and I don't know, there's some crap here, Asia Minor something. I think Crete is an island. Israel is over here. I'm not drawing Israel, that's supposed to be separate. But anyway, Sicily. So this is more or less the Mediterranean Sea. There's one theory that says that Noah and his family lived in the Mediterranean seabed, and that at the time there was a land bridge connecting these two. So it was something like this. And so you had the Atlantic Ocean over here where all this blue is, and this was just a big dry basin. And then this dam broke. And so a flood happened that filled the entire Mediterranean Sea. And that is one way that critics try to explain how so many cultures have flood stories, because it is uncanny. No matter where you go in the world, there are stories of a worldwide flood. And you could say, oh, well, every culture has floods, and so it would make sense that somebody somewhere, just about everywhere, would invent a story of a flood that was just so big, it took the whole world. But bottom of page 69, there really is something uncanny about the number and similarity of the flood narrative. So I'm going to read the did you know box there. There are more than 270 historical accounts of worldwide floods outside of the Bible. So I guess you could say there are more than 271 historical accounts of worldwide floods, because the Bible has one. The Hawaiian flood of account tells of a man named Nu'u and his family, who built a canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. And by the way, that is nowhere near the Mediterranean Sea. That's like literally the other side of the world. One Chinese flood account says the man took his 3 sons and 3 daughters aboard a boat to survive a flood that covered the highest mountains. Paintings of this account depict a dove with an olive branch flying toward the boat. So not only do you have the right number of people, but you also have the really distinct story of a dove carrying an olive branch to the boat that shows up in paintings. So that's really distinct. And Chinese is not exactly a Christianized culture. The Jews certainly never were sending anybody to China, and even the Christians barely made it to China in the earliest days of the New Testament. And then you've got the Toltecs, I don't know how to pronounce that, I apologize. Toltecs in Mexico tell of a flood that came 1,716 years after the creation, which fits the biblical genealogy. And after the flood, the people started building a tall tower to protect themselves from the next flood, but their languages become confused, so that they had to abandon the project. So this is pre-Christian Mexico. I know the conquistadors brought the word of God to Mexico in the 1500s, but this is before then. And so they have a timeline that fits the biblical account, and they have the account of the Tower of Babel. Are you guys familiar with the Tower of Babel account? Maybe a little bit? This one's worth telling. So after the flood, I'll go with red and black for this color scheme and get it over here. I really like those pictures. I'm pretty proud of that. I've tried to draw pictures of what's happening, or what may have happened in the flood a few times, and I'm pretty happy with those. But anyway, so after the after the flood, there were only 8 people, right? But they had to repopulate the world, and they did. And there's a few generations, 7 or so, I forget the number. A few generations of people, a few hundred years pass after the flood, and all of those people have decided to build a city rather than spread out. Let me just read it. It's a pretty short account. It's in Genesis chapter 10. Or no, chapter 11, actually. It's very short, so I'm going to read you the whole thing. You can follow along in your Bible if you want. Genesis chapter 11, beginning at verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. I don't know where the land of Shinar is. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Bitumen is tar, basically. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Why? Lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So it's worth noting that when Noah came off the ark, God told him to disperse over the earth. I can't remember exactly where that is. Genesis 9, verse 7. God is talking to Noah, and he says, "And you be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth and multiply in it." Teem is an old sounding word, but it basically means like multiply and thrive and cover it, cover the earth. And the descendants of Noah said, "No, we're not going to cover the earth. Instead, we're going to build a big city, and in the middle of the city, we're going to build a tower." And interestingly, they never actually give a reason why they're going to build this tower. Usually, the tower is depicted as something like this. See if I can get it right here. Yeah, it's not quite right, but anyway, so like a big old Dairy Queen ice cream cone thing there. Not the best picture of the Tower of Babel I've ever made, but it's depicted as something like that. And all that they say is that a tower with its top in the heavens, right? Tower with its top in the heavens. So it's interesting that the Mexican myth says that it's the Mexican account may or may not be a myth, says that they did it so that they could survive another flood. If you make a tall enough tower, then the flood waters will not be able to reach the top of it. So that might have been their thinking. But regardless of what it is, the reason they're doing this whole thing is so that they're not going to be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. They don't like that. In verse 5, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do." Right? This is a small rebellion. They want to stick together rather than team over the face of the earth. It's not like they're murdering each other. They actually just really like each other, I guess. But God knows that it's going to get worse. "Come," he says in verse 7. Oh wait, I missed the part. "And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." Right? So that sounds like a Disney movie. If we work together, we'll achieve the impossible. But when God says it on the tail of a global flood, it takes on a darker meaning. Nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. They're going to propose some pretty evil things. So, verse 7, God says, "Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. So that was God's reason for confusing their languages. It wasn't just that he wanted to not be able to cooperate, but he wanted to disperse them. He wanted to spread them out. And so that's what ended up happening. Is the people, unable to communicate with each other, had no choice but to leave that city and spread out over the face of the earth. And so that's the account of the Tower of Babel. And it's important because it explains the history of human society. Linguists can trace language development back to Indo-European languages and East Asian languages, and there's a few other language groups from which modern languages have evolved, but they all had their start at the Tower of Babel, and or Babel or Babel or however anybody wants to. It's the only significant account of a tower in the whole Bible, I think. So, if you hear about a tower in the Bible and it didn't fall on anybody, then it's probably the Tower of Babel. So that explains. This explains how all the people died and essentially were condensed on the earth, and that explains how they all wound up spreading out on the earth. What's up?
There's another story of a tower falling on someone?
There is, yes. Jesus mentions, it's totally unrelated, but Jesus is talking about where people wonder why God would allow bad things to happen to good people, and he just mentions that the Tower of Siloam fell and crushed a bunch of people to death. And he's like, and those people, do you think they were worse than anybody else? But no, I tell you, repent, or you too will likewise perish. So Jesus is, he's just referencing a current event. That's the only other place in the Bible I can think of where a tower is really mentioned. Rahab, the prostitute, lives in the wall of Jericho, which remains, and it looks like a tower after all the rest of the wall falls down, but I don't think it's ever actually called a tower. And I can't think of any other towers really in the Bible. So there it is. Page 70 in your book is a low-key advert for the Ark Encounter, which is a museum produced by Answers in Genesis, which most of the articles that I think so far all of the articles that I've given you on homework have come from the Answers in Genesis website. I'm quite familiar with it. There are other creationist ministries out there, but Answers in Genesis philosophically lines up very closely with our own church's beliefs, whereas other creationist groups tend to flirt a little more with other religions or, going outside the Bible for truth and things like that. But anyway, Answers in Genesis has a creation museum in Kentucky, south of Cincinnati, Ohio, that they built, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, closer to 20, and it was very successful. And so they built a second museum, but this one is built, it is a one-to-one life-size model of the Ark. It is built according to the dimensions that God gives to Noah in the book of Genesis, which I know I've gone over that with this group at least twice. Was 30 meters?
Yeah.
Whatever, it's really big. It's really stinking big. And I am pleased to announce that our church is going to be taking an organized trip to the Ark Encounter in the first part of June 2024. We're able to do it for about $850 a person, which is really cheap for a trip across the nation. I know it can be expensive, and it's certainly not going to be required for your confirmation grade. However, if you'd like to go to the Ark Encounter, which is what this museum is called, that's the way to do it. Elliot?
Won't we be confirmed by then?
Yeah.
Got it.
I already said it's not required. So it's double not required because you'll be confirmed by then. But, confirmation is a graduation from church, right? It's an initiation. It's step one of being a full-fledged Christian. It's not the end, it's the beginning. So as confirmed members, I would encourage you, along with your parents and whoever else can make it, to go on this trip, because inside of this life-sized ark, they have different exhibits that talk about how the animals could have been kept, how the people and the animals could have been fed, how waste might have been dealt with. They have all kinds of stuff. Of course, none of it is actually in the Bible, but the criticism against the Bible is that it's impossible. It's a silly story, and it never could have happened. And so all that this museum is trying to do is show you that actually it is possible. We don't have the Ark, we don't have a detailed account of what happened to take care of all of this stuff. We just know that it did happen. And the Ark Encounter does a good job of demonstrating scientifically how it might have worked. So page 70 is kind of an ad for that, but I'll read it anyway. Outside of Williamstown, Kentucky, crowds board a bus and head into the wooded countryside. As they come over the hill, they suddenly see a gigantic wooden ship on the horizon. Built according to biblical specifications, the Ark Encounter invites visitors to experience the history and science behind the flood account found in Genesis 6 through 9. Take a look at some of the information visitors can find at the Ark Encounter. Will it float? Marine engineers say the design and dimensions of the Ark match those of modern ocean-going commercial ships. And I believe I've made this point before. I'm going to erase my Tower of Babel there. But modern ocean ships are built in certain proportions, right? So if this is the biggest one ever made, right here, big old tanker ship, just there to carry lots and lots and lots of boxes and stuff. If this is the biggest one ever made, this might be a smaller version of it. But you see how it's still the same basic proportion, more or less square. It's actually, I should do it as close to realistic as I can. It's going to be more of a rectangle, like that on the front. More or less rectangular. So even though, they can get bigger or smaller, the proportions stay the same. That is, it's going to be about 5 times as long as it is tall, and things like that. These are examples of modern ocean liners, perhaps, and the ark, wherever it falls, follows the same proportions. So, what God knew about his creation and revealed to Noah, modern engineers have figured out from first principles, which is that is the ideal size for a large ocean-worthy vessel. And yeah, that's what Noah built it to. I always really like that piece of evidence because the Jews were not a seafaring people. They lived in the desert. Israel does not have any coastal real estate. They're not sailors. And yet Moses wrote down these dimensions that match perfectly with what ocean-going vessels should be, which I don't think anybody in those days would have known, but certainly not the desert-wandering Jews. So it really boggles the mind that if you're a skeptic trying to explain this, it really boggles the mind that that Noah's Ark the dimensions of Noah's Ark could have been so perfect. Ethnic diversity. People often ask, how could all of the different races in the world be descended from one family? Well, from the article that you read for homework last night, how many races are there really? One, right. We are all descended from the same people. It wasn't always believed that way, though. Famously I think it was in Tennessee, you could look up the Scopes trial, sometimes called the monkey trial. There was a trial, a legal trial that happened about 100 years ago, somewhere in Tennessee or something, where basically a school started teaching Darwin's theory of evolution, and there was a lot of backlash. And so the school district was actually sued by the Christians, saying, we don't want this crap taught in our schools. And in the midst of this legal trial, the Christians were humiliated. They sounded like idiots. They couldn't answer basic questions like, where did Cain get his wife? Or where did the different races come from if we're all descended from one family? Or something like that. They did end up winning the case, but it was such a public case that I would say overall it was a loss. And of course now evolution is taught everywhere. So it was definitely lost in the long term. For the record, Cain's wife would have been his sister, but the problem with inbreeding is that different genetic mutations are more likely to overlap and find expression if close siblings interbreed. But at the beginning, there were no genetic mutations. Adam and Eve would have been made perfectly, and so it wouldn't have been a problem for their children to interbreed. The problem of overlapping recessive mutations would have only developed as time went on and the human gene pool became more and more destroyed by the effects of sin and death and all that. And I like to argue that is why the average lifespan for humans plummeted after Noah's time. There's a genealogy in Genesis chapter 10, and there's a different genealogy in Genesis chapter 5. And if you just look at the numbers, chapter 5, you have a guy living 930 years, and 912 years, and 905 years, and 910 years. These are like massive lifetimes. These people are living almost 1,000 years. And, Methuselah died the same year, or perhaps the year before the flood happened. Methuselah is the oldest guy in Genesis chapter 5, so he's often recognized as the oldest man in history, which might not even be true. But he lived 969 years. But then if you go into Genesis chapter 10, is it? Where do we get, maybe it is 11.
No, because 11's stable.
Huh? 11? No, 11's where I want to go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Genesis chapter 11, let's see here. Shem, the son of Noah, lived 500 years. He lived more than that. Lived 600 years. Yeah, so Shem lived 600 years, and then his son lived 403 years, and then his son lived 403 years, then his son lived 430 years, and then we got 209 years, and then 207 years, and then 200 years, and then 119 years, and you can see the lifetimes begin to just plummet after Noah. And I posit it's because of inbreeding, because Adam and Eve had perfect genes, but Noah and Noah's wife did not. neither did their kids. And even though they had 3 kids with 3 wives who were presumably from outside the family, you still had kissing cousins at the very least from the next generation. And that level of inbreeding probably devastated the life expectancy of the human race. But that said, the ethnic diversity, the different racial characteristics really boil down to, melanin, how much melanin your skin produces, as well as a few other random characteristics like nose size and things like that. Things that are all, variables within the standard accepted norm of humanity. So yeah, it's really not hard to imagine that all of the different races we have today are all descended from Noah and his family. I personally would be curious if there are any races that were wiped out in the flood that were not present in the genes of Noah and his family, that maybe were lost. Maybe there were blue-skinned people. You'd never know. Smurfs. Oh gosh, I forgot Smurfs were still a thing. Room for the animals. The dimension of the ark provided over 1.5 million cubic feet of interior space. Scientists estimate there were probably about 16,000 individual animals on the ark. This would have only taken about half of the space available. So plenty of space for the animals to live and breathe and move, not to mention food to be stored and all of that. Water everywhere? If the earth were smooth like a billiard ball, there would be more than enough surface water to cover the entire globe of 1.9 miles deep. The biblical description of the fountains of the great deep bursting forth explains some of the massive changes that occurred on the earth in the flood. So I think that little cloud there, water everywhere, is trying to illustrate what I spent like a fourth of our class time on here. So just think about this. Volcanoes erupting all over the earth, tearing the surface of the earth and causing literal tectonic upheaval, and water coming out with it and then presumably sinking back into the mantle, and more of that kind of stuff. Okay, we probably won't get through page 71, but I'll go ahead and get started here. What? Okay. You want to finish the whole unit or the whole lesson?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Okay. Rock solid evidence. Let's start at the top. We're on page 71 now. A worldwide flood certainly would leave behind evidence in the geological record. As you study the account of the flood, consider this evidence. Folded sediments. We talked about this. Yeah, this is gonna be where you have to end tonight. The Grand Canyon and other locations around the world show folded layers of sedimentary rock. This is not possible unless the rocks experienced great upheaval from earthquakes or shifts in the Earth's crust. So here's what I want you to see here. Suppose we have lots of different rock layers, which we do. We'll do a progressive drawing. In the evolutionary time frame, this is the bad guys who think the Earth is super old. They believe that, so you got your bedrock here of cooled lava from the earliest days of the Earth, whatever. And then on top of the bedrock, for 10 million years, there was an ocean here, and it deposited some sand and other stuff, and that made a layer. And then something changed, who knows, currents, atmospheric currents, I don't know. Something changed, and for another 10 or so million years, there was a different kind of sediment being deposited on top of this first layer. And this goes on for the whole history of the Earth. Each of these layers that gets deposited is distinct from others, and these long-age scientists say that each of these layers took millions of years to form. So what happens is a layer of mud gets deposited here, and it kind of sits there. But as more and more layers get deposited on top, these bottom ones here are getting crushed, right? You have all of this downward force just pushing down on everything. And so these bottom layers become crushed, and they become rock. So rather than just being wet mud, they are crushed and yeah, like when you put tons and tons of force on mud, it becomes a solid rock. And so that's what happens there. This is sedimentary rock. If you've taken earth science class, rocks can be formed by compressed sediments. That's what this is. Now, at any given time, the only layer on this graph that is actually bendable is the top one. The top layer is mud. Everything beneath it has been compressed and hardened into rock. So, if something were to happen, I don't know, an earthquake that suddenly puts a huge upward force right here so that it transforms, this is what you would expect to see. Something like this. The bedrock is broken, and the next layer up is broken. Come on now. So the next layer up looks something like this. And onward and upward it goes. I can't draw these fast enough, but I think you get the idea, right? I'm trying to stick with the same scheme I have here. If something changes, what you would see is this broken structure, and maybe they'd be together, I don't know, but the point is that they would be clearly broken, right? Because they're rocks. And if you push down on the edges of a rock and up in the middle, you do something like, so suppose I got a thin layer of rock here, and I push down on the sides and up in the center, it's going to snap, right? It's going to crack, it's going to do that. So if this happens and this whole story is true, then this is what we would observe. This is not what we observe. This is not real. This isn't what happens. Instead, what we actually observe is, oh, come on, Black, don't do this to me, is this. These markers, I tell you what. We observe instead these folds in the rock. I'm drawing it in the wrong direction compared to the one picture that was in that article, but you get the idea, is we get these folds in the rock. And what that means is that when this upward force was applied here and forced the rocks upward into this fold, all of these layers were bendable. They were muddy. They were squishy. They were not solid, which is what the long-age geologists are assuming. So the reality is that all of these layers of rock were still soft and muddy when they were forced up. And that observation in modern times points us not to this long age theory, but rather to the creationist account, where all of these rock layers were deposited very quickly in a flood, and then there was tectonic upheaval in the years following that flood. So that is one major piece of evidence that I'd like to tout that actually defies the prediction of the long age geologists and confirms the prediction of the short age creationists. Okay, which are also geologists. I'm talking about geologists like they're bad guys. Geologists are just people who study rocks. There are some who do it well and some who do it poorly. So anyway, any questions on that? This is what was explained in that one homework assignment I gave with the bent rocks. I hope this better illustrates the problem with the evolutionary theory on that. All right, I've got some homework here for you. I promise this assignment is going to be easier than that one was. And yeah, let's go out and say our closing prayer together, and then you'll all be dismissed. There's no class next week. Have a Merry Christmas, and I'll see you in the new year.